somebody with, conventional thinking would assume, and rightfully so, given the conventional information, that if you consume red meat as a carnivore and you're having tons of that every day, you're going to have iron issues. So talk about what goes on in the body to compensate for that.
Well, number one, tons of meat every day would be impossible. I know that's just a turn of phrase, but let's be realistic about what it is. Now, I'm not a huge individual. I'm 5'6". I'm 140 pounds dripping wet. So I don't need as much food as, say, Sean Baker. Sean's got 100 pounds on me plus. So he eats a lot more meat than I do, but it's still relative to his body size. What I'm always promoting to people as a good starting point is your minimum protein intake per day ought to be 1.75 grams of protein per kilogram of lean body mass. Now, Americans will need to transmute those figures into pounds and whatever else to make it work. So they'll need to do some math, but it's not too hard. That's the minimum. And we go up to perhaps 1.5 times that. That'll be your sweet spot individually. And it's dependent on your age, your gender, your body size, your activity level, your training status, your stress and distress in your life, etc. That will affect all of that. But you'll hit on what the right level is over that time. So that's more meat than most people will eat on a mixed standard diet, absolutely. But it's not tons. Example, I would eat less than a pound a day, well and truly less than a pound of meat. And Sean Baker, around about 2 pounds, give or take, whatever it is, just for two examples of two relatively prominent carnivores that we know about. Dr. Anthony Chaffee, I think, eats a similar amount to what Sean Baker does, but he's a similar sort of body size as well. He's another 6 foot plus muscled, bloke in his 30s, as it turns out, for Anthony Chaffee. Age also comes into how much meat you need, by the way. So both Sean and I are past 50, so we would need less than Anthony Chaffee would, for example. Whatever. So this idea with iron problems, which iron problems do you mean?
I mean, just you hear that if you're to consume a carnivore diet in the health space, again, I'm being very vague here, but I don't have specific examples, that you're going to accumulate too much iron in the body and cause issues.
Right. Okay. So there are a couple of very interesting points there. Number one, the exact form of iron that is required by the human body to have biological use, to be usable by the human body at all, is a form of iron which is biochelated to a protein called heme, Heme. Heme iron is what you need. And why do we need that? Well, its primary role is in the carriage and capacitance for oxygen in your body. Heme iron is completely, absolutely, and utterly non-toxic, precisely because it is protected by the way it's carried around the body by the proteins that it's biochelated to. They encapsulate the thing. They package the thing in such a way that it can be stored long-term in your body for use when it's needed in a encapsulated, safe, non-leaky, non-problematic binding, if you like. The other way that we can get iron into our bodies is through non-heme iron, the kind of iron that you'll find in plant foods, for example. That is toxic, highly toxic, and that absolutely will cause you a problem. Heme iron will not. The only thing that these people point to when they're talking about, oh, heme iron's a problem, is they're looking at associative studies where they follow large populations of people by way of respondent survey returns So they don't measure anything. They don't keep these people in labs. They don't keep them under control. These people are free living under their own recognizance for multiple decades. And every few years they get sent a questionnaire that they fill out. So that's the first problem. Write this down. People tell lies about what they've been eating and how often, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, if we take 100,000 people, 200,000 people, or 1 million people and equate the incidence of, for example, various cancers with their reported intake of heme iron, we might get this really quite weak associative relationship between those factors. It really is very, very weak, by the way. Now, I'll talk about how statistically significant this finding is. This is their propaganda. This is how they sell their bill of goods. Yes, it is statistically significant. Statistical significance is determined by the sample size more often than anything else. The larger your sample size, the smaller an effect can be before it statistically happened due to anything other than dumb chance, parsimoniously. So you can have this minuscule effect and say, look how statistically significant that is. P equals 0.00000. Well, that's very meaningful. Ergo, my case has been made. But then you look back and you trace it back and you go, well, what does that actually mean in practice? The baseline incidence for these kind of cancers they're talking about in the populations that they generally look at generally tends to run at around about 8 per 10,000 person years of follow-up at baseline in the zero intake of this nasty meat-based poison somehow. They sometimes find maybe a 25, maybe 30% difference in the incidence of cancer at the high end of meat intake. So that equates to a difference of less than 2 per 10,000 years of follow-up for any given individual. Now, given that a human lifespan is, let's say, 100 years, we would need to divide that 2 per 10,000 down to per 100 years to find out what the difference in risk is for that individual, wouldn't we? If that was a cause and effect relationship, which it is not, because of the milieu of uncontrolled covariates, confounds, collinearities, healthy user bias, unhealthy user bias, all these things that affect a person's hard-baked outcomes in their life. Do they get cancer or do they not get cancer over the next 10 years in this study, for example? So what we have is a weak association with no real meaning for any one given living human being over a 100-year lifespan, which we're going to call statistically significant in order to sell it to people. And we're going to assume by lack of a statement to the contrary that this associative data set is cause and effect, which it isn't. It's utter nonsense. It's pseudoscience. It's crackpottery of the highest order. It's actually criminal that these people are basically putting these studies forward, and they're doing it for 2 reasons. One, because in academia there's a thing called publish or perish, whereby you need to publish a number of articles every year as an academic, otherwise you might not get continued the next year. Your professorship is, your ongoing professorship while you're working in academia is dependent on your outputs of research articles. So you need to publish something. So collect some data up, describe your data in a frankly criminal and very, very misleading manner to sell it to people and make it really important. And then go back to the source of funding that you got for your study, because science costs money to do. So you need to get funding from somewhere. Who has money, by the way? Oh, that's right. Industry has money. And what does industry do in the food area? That's right. They want to sell you things. So who is it that's likely to fund a study where we're going to say red meat causes cancer? Well, it's going to be the wheat growers, isn't it? And when I say the wheat growers, what I actually mean by that is big agriculture, not just wheat, all the various plant crops that people grow for so-called food for people. And those guys, by the way, own the dietetics associations outright, if you follow the money. So they basically own the education of so-called nutrition, so-called professionals. And so we get this hymn sheet that we're all singing off, or they're all singing off, whereby they're all saying these things like, oh, look, statistically significant association between red meat consumption and cancer. Ergo, you're left to assume that means you shouldn't eat red meat. No, there's no evidence for that. It's ridiculous. It's laughable. Anyway, there you go. Long answer, but that's what it is.
Let's come back to the heme iron versus non-heme iron. You mentioned non-heme in plants is toxic. I want to come back to that in a sec. But we have the heme in meat. If we are consuming more, though, does the body have a system? You mentioned it's non-toxic, but does the body have a system to get rid of that? Or does it just like the fact that it's getting more on that carnivorous diet?
Yeah. The human body will store things that it can store without doing itself too much mischief, I guess, like heme iron and those kind of things that need to be stored for a rainy day. In the natural course of events, we would also store excess foods as fat, foods that we don't need right now that we've taken in because we could get it. However, I challenge you to find a cave painting of a fat caveman. They lived very differently. They had very different lifestyles. We've changed our lifestyles hugely, markedly, unrecognizably over the last even 100, 150 years, which in terms of genetic drift is an absolute flash in the pan. There's no way our genes could react quickly enough to optimize our health based on our current lifestyle. And that's why it hasn't happened. That's why we're getting fatter, we're getting sicker, more and more diabetes, more and more cancer, more and more heart disease. It's because we're eating a diet that is completely inappropriate for us as a species, and the lifestyles that we're living are also completely inappropriate for us in terms of our genes and the speciation that we are. And it's going to be, a good number of generations before we get back to any kind of equilibrium, I would suggest.
Let's come back to the non-heme iron now. Say somebody's on a vegan diet. They're not getting the heme iron. They're getting the non-heme iron, which is toxic, which I want you to explain more about. What happens in the body?
Okay.
You explained the 5-year thing where vegans can sometimes get away with it. Does the iron relate to that at all?
Sure. I mean, the iron toxicity plays a part in the various problems that vegans typically experience. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's not the answer by itself. The kind of toxicity I'm talking about is that iron can act both as an oxidant and an antioxidant, depending on other circumstances. So non-heme iron can be highly oxidating, highly damaging to human tissues if it's not encapsulated in the heme, for example. Too much iron can be neurotoxic. Too much iron can cause other electrolyte imbalances at the level of the kidney, for example. In a very, very severe circumstance of iron toxicity, obviously that person will die. It will kill that person. Very, very rare for that to occur, but it's not unheard of. The human body can transmute a small amount of non-heme iron into heme iron by biochelating that itself with its own manufactured heme, but the human capacity to do so is very, very low. And it just makes absolutely no sense to attempt to get the iron in the form that you need it by consuming iron in a form that's completely unlike what you need, basically. So it's neurotoxicity, it's hepatic toxicity, really. It's cardiac toxicity as well. It's oxidative damage that can occur. It's not a good idea to load your body up with non-heme iron at all.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
Insulin resistance is a normal, natural, indicated, and useful biological process. It is not a pathology, and it is not the cause of diabetes. The diet that these so-called scientists